Okay, so you want to own a medieval shipyard. The tide is running higher than it has all month, and a merchant ship the size of a parish church is being walked in on ropes with her ballast already lifted out of her. Men have spent 6 weeks driving fresh timber into her flank. The cradle underneath her is new, oak and elm, cut and assembled on the mud for this one job. She settles onto it, the wood takes her weight, and for a few seconds, everything holds. Then the starboard side goes. 200 tons of another man's property rolls over in front of you and begins filling with river. Price this trade properly and the answer comes out strange. The ship is the cheapest thing in that yard, and it is the one thing you are never going to own. Very few people think about who owns the hull on the slipway. Not on launch day, from the first plank. Very few ask who pays the sawyers through the 11 months before there is anything to look at, or what happens to a yard full of felled oak when the man who ordered it changes his mind. So let's put one together from bare ground. Price every part of it, then take it apart again. The first thing that goes wrong with the fantasy is that you are picturing a building. England did not really have shipyards for most of the Middle Ages. Ships were built wherever timber, water, and labor happened to meet. A riverbank, a beach, a tidal creek behind a town. Purpose-built yards do not become normal until the early 15th century. Before that, a shipyard was an event. It happened, then it stopped happening, and the ground went back to being ground. Even at the very top of the market, this held. When Henry V ordered the largest ship England had ever attempted, a dock was cut near Town Quay in Southampton specifically to build her. Not a permanent facility, a hole in the ground, dug for one customer. Go looking for the physical remains and you mostly find fields. At Smallhithe in Kent, a river-connected community that built ships for the crown, what survives is earthworks under grass. Yards went up where the wood was, did their work, and vanished. So what are you actually buying? Not the forest. You buy trees from men who own woodland, not the iron, which arrives from a smith who prices it by weight, and not the ship, which belongs to the buyer from the moment the keel is laid. The largest object on your property is, legally, somebody else's. A shipyard was a slope, a stack of wood, and a promise. One adjustment before we start spending. If you have a feel for medieval money from a butcher's shop or a smithy, trades that turn on pennies a day, put it down. This one runs in hundreds of pounds, and you will not see any of it again for the better part of a year. Put yours on the water at Southampton in the 14 teens, because that is where the surviving evidence is thickest. A merchant there named William Soper is about to start building warships for Henry V, and we will be following him for the rest of this video. Right now, he has exactly what you have, bare ground. You need a bank that slopes into water deep enough to float whatever you build, which is rarer than it sounds. Too steep and you cannot work on it. Too shallow and your finished hull sits in mud until the equinox. Tidal frontage is worth paying for because the tide does your lifting for free. That is your first cost, and it is rent or purchase on land somebody already owns. Next comes the slip, the prepared path the hull rests on and slides down. Timber, packed ground, grease. It is the only part of the yard whose entire purpose is to be used once, for about 90 seconds at the very end. Saw pits after that. 2 men to a pit, one standing in daylight, one underneath in the dark eating sawdust. You will need several running at once because a hull consumes planks faster than any 2 men alive can cut them. Set a smithy near the water. Every fastening in that ship comes out of it. We will not linger because here the forge is a line in your accounts, not a character in the story. Pitch house after that, which is the smell of the entire trade. Your timber stack is the yard's real inventory and its real risk. Green wood warps. Seasoned wood costs more and takes years you do not have. Every log lying there is capital sitting in the open air where it can be stolen, burned, or valued by a royal officer. And hold on to that last one because it comes back. Tools next, and this is the line to pay attention to. Adzes, adze hammers, augers, draw knives, caulking irons, mallets. Who owns them is going to matter enormously later, and almost nobody notices it at the time. A watchman, one man, paid to do nothing whatsoever except confirm that the previous 8 items are still there in the morning. He is the only wage that carries on when the work stops. Working capital last, wages every week for something close to a year before there is a finished object to hand anybody. So what does all that come to? The best surviving English answer is 120 years older than the yard we are building, so treat it as a benchmark and not a quote. In 1294, Edward I ordered war galleys from 20 ports at once. Newcastle's accounts survive. Timber, 50 pounds, 8 shillings and 4 pence. Nails, 22 pounds, 16 shillings and 7 pence halfpenny. Pitch, tar, and caulking material, 11 pounds and 2 shillings. Carpenter's wages, 66 pounds, 4 shillings and a penny 3 farthings. Those recorded inputs add up to 150 pounds, 11 shillings and a penny and a quarter. Now, and this matters more than it looks, later summaries of that same ship put the real figure nearer 205 pounds. That gap is not bad history. That gap is the distance between what a clerk wrote down and what a job actually cost. And it is going to follow us all the way to the end of this video. One anchor, so the numbers mean something. A laborer's day in this period is worth about 4 pence, which makes a pound roughly 60 days of a man's working life. Newcastle sits in cheaper times, when unskilled labor cost half that. So 150 pounds is near 18,000 days of human effort, standing in a field in the north of England. And you have not yet cut down a tree. 21 men built that galley. 41 weeks, keel to launch. Read the list of who they were, because it kills the lone craftsman image for good. A master shipwright and his assistant, carpenters, hammermen, men called holders up, whose job was to brace a rivet from the far side while somebody else hit it, painters, riggers, smiths, sawyers, a squad brought in purely to get the finished hull into the water, a watchman, and, from the accounts of the same building program, women hired to clear the wood chips off the site, which is the only reason we know they were ever there. That is not a workshop. It is a village with a lifespan of 41 weeks. Every one of them is paid weekly, in coin, by you. Nothing comes back in until the ship is handed over. 4 months into the job, you have spent a fortune and you own a shape. Now the trees. A Viking-scale hull, rebuilt in our own time using period methods, took 14 oaks of roughly 3 feet across, worked by 8 men and an apprentice. Scale that upward and it gets strange quickly. One great 16th century warship is estimated to have swallowed something like 600 mature oaks. Call it 40 acres of woodland. Treat that as a reconstruction rather than a receipt, because only about a third of that ship survives to measure. The order of magnitude is what counts. Every hull you launch is a wood that no longer exists. Then there is the ceiling, the least glamorous line on the list, and the one that decides whether the thing floats. Caulking recovered from medieval wrecks turns up moss, plant fiber, animal hair, and in one case inlaid wool, all driven into the seams and sealed under pitch. No standard recipe survives, because there wasn't one. Yards used whatever was abundant and cheap locally, which means the waterproofing on the most valuable object in the county was improvised from the hedgerow. Here's the part that surprises anyone who has ever priced building work. On the Newcastle job, the nails came to 22 pounds. The carpenters, across 41 weeks, came to 66. The iron holding that ship together cost roughly a third of every wage paid on the site. In a trade everybody pictures as woodwork, the fasteners are eating a third of your payroll. None of it is local either. The ship we opened with was planked with oak felled about 100 miles inland in the Basque Country. Baltic oak moved west by the shipload into English and Flemish ports. Your yard sits at the far end of a supply line beginning in a forest in somebody else's kingdom, and any link in it can be cut by weather, war, or a customs officer having a difficult week. So far, this is an excellent method for spending a fortune and giving away a ship. Here's where the trade starts making money. Almost none of it comes from building. Begin with the obvious stream and then watch it get less obvious 4 times over. Repair. A wooden ship is not a product, it is a subscription. Seams work loose, planks split, worm gets into anything below the waterline, and sooner or later, the whole vessel has to come out of the water and be gone over by people who know what they are doing. That work is far smaller than a build. It is also endless, and it does not require you to lay out a year of wages before you see a penny. Venice worked this out before anybody. The Arsenal, the most famous shipyard in Europe, began around 1104 as a place to maintain and repair privately built ships, and did not become a serious builder for another 2 centuries. The most powerful naval yard on the continent spent its first 200 years as a garage. Dante, writing around 1315, described the place out of season. Men caulking hulls that cannot sail, boiling pitch, one hammering at the prow and another at the stern. Winter is not your dead season. Winter is your other business. Stores, quieter and better. Every ship that comes in needs rope, canvas, pitch, nails, and spars, and here is the trick, so does every ship that is going nowhere. When Henry VII made Robert Brigandine clerk of the king's ships in 1495, the pay was 12 pence a day, with another 6 pence a day to hire himself a clerk. Trivial money. But the post explicitly allowed him to profit from supplying ships' requisites while vessels were fitted out, or laid up and not at sea. He was not really being paid to run ships, he was being paid in the right to sell things to them. Upkeep on ships that never move. Henry V's great ship launched in 1418 and made exactly 1 voyage in 1420. Part of her crew mutinied, she put in at the Isle of Wight, and she never went to sea again. She then sat at her mooring in the Hamble, maintained by a permanent crew of 8 men until 1439. Read that back. 19 years of continuous paid upkeep on a vessel that had already finished being useful. A ship going nowhere still leaks, and somebody is billing for that. Before anyone asks what she cost to build in the first place, there is a figure in circulation, and I am leaving it out, because it traces to later summaries rather than to an account. Salvage. Rebuilding a hull on the frame of an old one was standard practice, and the arithmetic behind it is obvious. You sell the outdated fittings and the scrap, then cut the timber bill on the replacement. That great ship burned to the waterline in 1439 after a lightning strike. A gang of 10 laborers went in to recover the metal fixtures. Our ship in the Pill lost her anchors, her masts, her guns, and her heavy rigging before anybody accepted she was finished. A dead ship is a warehouse. And then the one that actually matters. William Soper, our Southampton merchant, ended up supervising the construction of Henry V's fleet. He also, and this is the whole video in one man, owned ships. The Julian of Hampton, rated at 140 ton, was out supporting a naval patrol in 1418. He later acquired the Valentine out of the Royal Fleet itself and sent her to Bordeaux in 1426, loaded with grain, coal, fish, and cloth. Follow what he did there. He built the King's Navy. Then he bought a ship out of the navy he had built. Then he ran freight with it. The yard was never the business. The yard was how you got close enough to the business to buy into it. Price the difference. In Venice, chartering a single merchant galley for one voyage could run to something like 9,200 ducats before you had paid a crew or loaded a barrel. The men who physically built hulls were paid by the day. Same water, same wood. The margin was never in making the ship. The margin was in being on the right side of the thing once it floated. Which raises a fair question. If the office pays almost nothing, why does everybody want it? Because you are not being paid in money, you are being paid in position. Soper drew a shilling a day as surveyor of the king's ships. Brigandine, 12 pence. Against the sums moving through their hands, that is a rounding error. What the office actually bought was the supply monopoly on stores, first refusal when the crown broke up its fleet, and a legal standing from which to trade. Valuable enough, it turns out, to break the law for, repeatedly, in public. A petition to the Parliament of 1390 had demanded specifically that no customs officer own ships of his own or involve himself in the freight of other men's. Soper was, simultaneously, the king's clerk of ships, a customs official at Southampton, and a merchant shipping his own cargo. On one occasion, a royal searcher asked the master of Soper's Valentine to produce his license for exporting 700 quarters of corn. The master's response was to make sail and leave. That is what the position was worth. The same arrangement cuts against you, though, and you should price it in. Purveyance gave the crown the right to take what it needed at an appraised price rather than a market one. After a century of inflation, appraised meant a fraction of worth. That timber stack you were told to remember can be valued by a royal officer and carted off, and you will be paid what he says it is worth, eventually, on a piece of paper. Your men could go the same way. Skilled ship carpenters were impressed for royal work like sailors, and refusing carried a prison term. Underneath all of it sits a timing problem. The crown was a magnificent customer and an appalling payer. You did the work first and were settled with later, sometimes years later, sometimes against revenue nobody had collected yet, on the strength of a written promise. For long stretches, you are financing the king's navy out of your own pocket, hoping the paper is honored. Venice ran the identical mechanism from the opposite direction, subsidizing shipwrights, restricting trade in foreign-built vessels, controlling access to timber. Different republic, same insight. The margin in this trade came from policy, not from craft. You are not a builder. You are a defense contractor who happens to own some adzes. By now, this looks like a trade with 3 separate ways to get paid. Here is what takes all 3 away in an afternoon. Newport on the River Usk in the spring of 1468. The ship from the opening of this video is a merchantman of around 200 tons, roughly 10 years old, Basque-built, and she has come in for a major refit. She has been floated into a side channel on the highest tide of the month, deballasted, and lowered onto a cradle your men built for her. English oak is being shaped and driven into a Spanish hull. It is serious, well-paid, months-long work, and it is the best thing on your books. Then the starboard supports fail. She cannot be refloated. Everything worth taking is stripped off her, and what is left stays in the silt of the Usk for the next 534 years, which is exactly how we know any of this. You did not lose a contract. You lost a merchant's ship on your own ground in fine weather. Now watch the yard come apart in precisely the order you built it. Working capital goes first. It was never really there. It left as wages weeks ago. The watchman is the last man you can justify, and the first who looks like waste. Tools walk out with the master shipwright because they were always his. The timber stack rots, or a purveyor values it and carts it off. Pitch house, smithy, saw pits. Worth what the scrap weighs. The slip silts within a season, and the ground goes back to being ground. 9 things. Not one of them survives the end of a contract. There is a slower version of the same ending, and that one does not need anybody to make a mistake. Henry V died in 1422, and his ships were treated as personal property and sold off to settle his debts. Soper stayed in post until 1442, by which point there was effectively no fleet left to keep. His entire order book had been one man, and the man died. Venice met the slowest version of all. From the middle of the 15th century, its reachable oak, larch, and fir were being depleted beyond recovery. Conservation was attempted, and it failed, because forests do not refill on a business timescale. So there are 3 ways to lose this business: an afternoon, a funeral, or a century. So let's do the sum properly, both columns. In a good year, you have a build contract running and a refit book that fills the winter. Stores are moving. You hold a share in a hull that is out earning freight while you sleep. The weekly wage bill is covered without borrowing, which in this trade is the whole definition of comfort. And at the end of it, you are a man of standing in a port town, which is worth something no ledger records. Put rough figures on it. A build occupies most of your year and your entire workforce, and the margin on it is thin, because the buyer knows what timber and iron cost as well as you do. The refits are where the year is actually won. Small jobs, weeks not months, no year-long wage exposure, and a customer who has no choice, because a leaking hull is not a thing you shop around with. Stack enough of those against a single build and the winter carries the summer. In a bad year, the arithmetic turns on you from 4 directions at once. Your patron cancels or dies. A purveyor values your timber. Baltic prices move, and the oak you need is suddenly coming 500 miles at somebody else's number. Or the supports under a client's ship give way on a calm afternoon. Count what that last one costs. Not the repair fee you have now lost. The ship itself, which was somebody's principal asset. The cargo trade she was booked for. The reputation of a yard where ships fall over. In a port town where every ship owner drinks in the same 3 rooms. One afternoon ends a business that took a decade to assemble, and no insurance exists to argue otherwise. Meanwhile, the ground, the watchman, and the master shipwright you cannot afford to lose to the next town along all cost exactly what they cost in a good year. Fixed costs do not read the room. So, could you actually get rich owning a medieval shipyard? Yes, but not from shipbuilding. That answer is not a dodge. It is the finding. Every route to real money in this trade ran through the yard and out the other side, into ownership, office, or supply. The building itself was the entry fee. Here is the rule this one proves, and it has nothing to do with ships. The profitable half of a business is usually the half that happens after the product is finished. I found 9 more like that. A Roman bathhouse that stayed solvent because the dull flats upstairs carried the glamorous business below. An alewife who was busy every single day of her life and still went under on a collection gap. 10 dead businesses. 10 rules that still run modern ones, each one rebuilt from the original evidence, in the owner's ledger, linked below. Compare 2 men who stood in the same mud. Soper died holding an estate near the New Forest. He sat in the Commons 11 times between 1414 and 1449, and was appointed a verderer of the royal forest, which put a shipbuilder in charge of the king's deer, in woodland full of oak. Brigandine's salary was pocket change, and his supply rights were not. Against them, the master shipwright, the one person on that site who could take a curved tree and see a hull inside it, who worked without drawings, by eye and by memory, and on whom the entire enterprise depended. He was paid a carpenter's wage for a shipwright's risk. When the job finished, he walked home carrying his own tools, because they had never belonged to the yard in the first place. Notice the shape of that. The most skilled man in the business owned his tools and nothing else. The least skilled thing in the business, arranging for other men to do work and taking a position on the result, owned land, ships, and a seat in Parliament. And it was not really a question of talent. Soper could not have shaped a keel to save his life. What he had was the ability to see that the hull leaving his slipway was going to keep earning for 30 years, and to make sure that when it did, some of that money came back to him. So the men who got rich in this trade have one thing in common. Every single one of them, at some point, stopped selling ships. Settle the account. 9 items, one last time. The ground, reverted. The slip, silted. Saw pits, filled in. The smithy, sold for what the iron weighed. Pitch house, burned for fuel by somebody who needed a fire more than a business. The timber stack, gone at the purveyor's price, whatever he decided that was. The tools, with the shipwright, where they started. The watchman, paid off and not sorry. And the working capital, spent 11 months ago on wages for a ship that belonged to another man from the day the keel was laid. Which leaves that missing £50 in the Newcastle account, the gap between what the clerk wrote and what the job cost. That gap is the the entire trade. Medieval shipbuilding survives in the record as a list of materials because materials are what clerks write down. Timber has a price and a quantity. Nails can be counted. The part that actually made anyone wealthy, the refit nobody itemized, the coil of rope sold quietly off the stack, the quarter share in a hull, the office worth 12 pence a day, and a great deal more than that in practice, was never going to turn up in an account roll because nobody involved had any reason to write it down. Which is why we can tell you to the farthing what the iron cost in 1294, and cannot tell you what a single private shipbuilder earned in a year anywhere in medieval England. The receipts that survive are the ones the state kept, and the state was not interested in your margin. We know what the wood cost. We have almost no idea what the men made. What's left, in the end, is a slope of mud with some post holes in it, and a man who now owns 2 ships.